those who haven't been to a one-on-one session before, this is our third one in a series this year. And the concept is just to provide introductory level type, basic fundamental information on a variety of topics that we tend to take for granted, that everybody just knows this. And that's not always the case. And so this session is on the Texas core curriculum. And it's timely because, many of you know, we've just been through a great process. I don't think it was a great process, but we've been through a great process on updating our core. So this is timely. I will say, as a way of introduction, as I said, a great process. Every school in Texas has had to do this. It's not just a Lone Star. We didn't just decide we're going to update our core. Every college and public university has struggled with this, and we struggled a little bit with it. And while our process wasn't perfect, it was good in a lot of ways. And some of, now that we're getting towards the end of all of this, hearing from other colleges where faculty are saying, they just told me what was going to be in the core. There was no faculty. There are colleges, system office, academic affairs got a call from another college, will remain nameless, and said, what are y'all doing with the core? We haven't done anything yet, and the deadline's in November. And so we're in good shape. So as bad as it may have felt, we're actually in pretty good shape with what we've done. So what we're going to do today is, of course, outcomes are on the brain because we're always talking about program learning outcomes or student learning outcomes. We've got to think of outcomes for the session. I want to just describe the scope and purpose of the core curriculum in Texas, because Texas is a bit unique in that we have a state-driven core curriculum. Accreditation requirements, state laws, regulations, discuss some of the recent changes and what the new core is going to propose to look like, nothing's approved yet, and then talk just in closing about the importance of completing the core. I hope that sounds like what you hoped you would gain. And certainly this will be conversational. If you have questions along the way, just ask. So our scope and purpose for the core is driven by two agencies, not surprisingly, Southern Association and the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. From the SACS perspective, there are two areas that address the core, and from the SACS 101, if you were here, a core requirement are those very few things. If you don't get it right, you could lose your accreditation right away. Well, core curriculum's addressed as a core requirement, a gen ed component. So is a comprehensive standard 3.5.3 also addresses gen ed or the core. In Texas, when we say general education, it's synonymous with core curriculum. We tend to use that language back and forth. Texas Administrative Code and Texas Education Code also govern the state of Texas's core curriculum. And so it's very much framed in accreditation and legislation on what colleges and universities have to cover in a core curriculum. We get to select the courses, but the requirements and framework parameters are established for us. So here's the SACS core requirement. I'm not going to read it to you. I hope you can see it. Do I need to dim the lights on here? Y'all can see that okay? Okay. The institution requires successful completion of a general ed component at the college level, substantial component of each undergraduate degree. Typical SACS, what does substantial mean? Ensures breadth of knowledge and is based on a coherent rationale. Okay, so there's some broad language on what the core must be framed as. But then it goes to include that it has to come from these following areas: humanities, fine arts, social behavior science, natural science, math. You'll see this kind of language when we see the Texas legislation as well. They can't, these courses, SACS core requirement, I'll keep emphasizing that, but this is a core requirement. The courses cannot narrowly focus on skills, techniques, or procedures specific to a particular occupation or profession. And that's a key piece to remember, because that was some of the controversy that you will see in a little bit that we got to even in some of our own discussions about what courses should be in the core. And then for degree completion, it must be a minimum of 15 hours. Of course, state requires it to be 42 hours. So Texas Administrative Code has very general, similar language to what you saw with SACS. They will gain a foundation of knowledge of human cultures, physical and natural world, principles of personal and social responsibility, living in a diverse global world, advanced intellectual practical skills essential for learning. That's in the state of Texas administrative code, that kind of general education, all graduates should be able to do these things. They define the core curriculum in the Texas Education Code. So we've got administrative code, education code, saying that it's a curriculum in the liberal arts, humanities, sciences, political, social, cultural history, all undergraduate students of an institution of higher ed must complete. Okay, so that is up to the institution to decide what that core is, but for a student to earn a degree, they have to complete that core that addresses these areas. Now the board referenced in this code, education code, is referring to the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Because it's the coordinating board's responsibility to implement state laws related to higher education. And that's our Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board one-on-one series in June. The advisory committees represented here, you're going to see in a minute, is a committee called UEAC, the Undergraduate Education Advisory Committee. And I'll explain that more in just a little bit, but that's referenced here in the code. And it says, shall develop a recommended core of at least 42 semester credit hours. Well, that now is definitively 42 hours. It's not at least, it's 42 hours. No more, no less, it's 42 hours. That created some challenges as we revised the core. Clean statement, content, component areas, objectives. Now, a little bit of history. 1987 in the 70th legislature was the first time that this conversation in Texas about having a state core curriculum emerged. I was a sophomore at Texas Tech University in 1987. Had no idea that was going on, that conversation. In 1997, 10 years later, everything was repealed from this bill, Senate Bill 148, but they retained the fundamental components of the idea of a gen ed core curriculum for the state. In 1988, the core that we're operating under now, which will change in fall 14, was adopted. And then what do you notice between 1988 and 2009? Nothing. There was a long time that passed before anybody said, you know, maybe we need to reconsider what's in the Texas core curriculum. So it was, as I referenced earlier, this undergraduate UEAC, Undergraduate Education Advisory Committee, that's comprised of representatives just like me and you from colleges all over the state, submitted this report on designing Texas undergraduate education in the 21st century. And it was that report that suggested that maybe it was time that the core curriculum be looked at again. That was submitted to the commissioner, and he then, as we know, if you suggest something in a meeting, then it's often turned around on you to say, well, that's a great idea. Why don't you go do that? I think that happened to Deborah the other day. I'm looking at you for, I can't remember what we did, but Deborah, you do that. So the UEAC was charged with that in 2009. In 2011, they submitted their recommendations to the coordinating board, and through this report, Revising the State Core Curriculum, Focus on 21st Century. Those of you may remember, I think it was 2012, Rex Peebles from Midland chaired this whole process, and he was here speaking at one of our curriculum kickoff days. I can't remember if that was 11 or 12. It wasn't this year. I think it was last year. Doesn't matter. Coordinating board in 2011 considered the UEAC's recommendations, and in August there was a public comment period, and then in October they approved the new rules for the core in 2011. 2012 there was some minor tweaks, but it wasn't anything really significant. So then what happened after that? So the intent was, after the coordinating board approved the new rules and structure, that from November 2011 to November 2013, that faculty would develop and select the courses. Now, what is this month? November 2013, and guess what goes to our Board of Trustees tomorrow night? So Lone Star, really, we just barely squeezed in on the deadline for this, and I'll explain why here in just a minute. From August 2013 to November 2013, institutions could submit their core to this coordinating board for review. I may be wrong about this, but it's my understanding that the few colleges that submitted early really haven't heard back yet if the coordinating board has approved it, because the coordinating board's not taken action on that yet. Part of the conversations in the curriculum teams in the process of revision was, well, such and such college submitted their core, they've got this in their core. That's what was submitted, but we don't know that that's what the coordinating board approved. So that was confusing as we were trying to compare to other schools, et cetera. Now, I may be totally wrong about that. There may have been some that got approved. My general sense is that those have not been officially approved. Then fall 2014 is the implementation of the core for all incoming freshman folks. So here's what we did. In spring 2012, which wasn't too long after that November 11th, 2011, some of you were there. There was a Q&A session at each college about this process for revising the core. It seemed okay, moving forward. Curriculum teams were scheduled to submit their proposals using forms and templates and rubrics and all this stuff by fall 2012. The first two curriculum teams to submit were English and speech. And it was starting to become a bloodbath, just frankly. The way the structure of the new core is, it just pitted them against each other in not some healthy ways. And so also about this time is reorg at system office. And there's just a lot of floating things happening in variables. Dr. Rogers, Carrie Rogers, came December 2012 after observing what had happened so far in the process and sitting in a committee meeting. It was probably a Friday afternoon, it seems like, it's always when this stuff like this happens. Found myself in a committee meeting with her, and we were trying to understand what's going on, what do we need to do differently, what's not working about this. And it became very clear that while we had this idea of the state structure and SAC structure, Lone Star really didn't know what it was trying to accomplish through a general education core curriculum. And we didn't have that kind of guiding light or that kind of guiding philosophy or statement. So in December, a Gen Ed Vision Committee made up of faculty was formed. Doug Boyd was our rep. I had to remember that. Van, I always get you and Doug confused, so if I ever call you Doug, I'm sorry. And I call Doug Van. I called Kathy, I'm like, which one was it? Doug was our representative on that. I'll show you that vision statement in a minute. But folks felt like that was an important enough piece to go ahead and pause the process for a little bit and develop that statement. And then there was also reconsideration of just the process itself. Then in spring 2013, so kind of a year later, here we are, process is restarted, the Gen Ed committee establishes new guidelines, develop proposal forms, etc. And then everybody was gone for the summer. And so we were kind of in a bind just even having access to faculty and curriculum teams and discussion. So there was a very, very tight time crunch on folks. And many of the teams did communicate over the summer and work on this. But when we came back then in August, into August, curriculum team day, one of the major focal points for the curriculum teams was the core and the proposals. Those proposals were submitted to the Gen Ed committee in October 2013. That went through faculty senate presidents, dean's council as far as information goes, but the VPI council was presented with a recommendation. And we were in the unfortunate situation of having to say yay or nay and moving that forward to EC, Executive Council. We moved it forward, Executive Council approved it, and tomorrow night our Board of Trustees considers it. So it's still, even the piece of paper I handed out, still is not, we don't know. still is not 100% sure that's what the core is going to be. The deadline to submit to the coordinating board is mid-November someday, I don't remember the exact day. And in February 2014, coordinating board considers those statewide. We'll know in March what the status is of ours. And it's a very real possibility that if there's any delay in that, the publication of the next catalog could be delayed because we've got to have that in the catalog. So just heads up, catalog publication may be held up if there's any issues here. And then fall 2014, the new core is effective. We all know that registration for fall starts really early, so that's going to be, there could be some tough challenges in there as students are trying to register, but we don't really know what the new core is. Now, most of that is probably going to be fine. We just can't definitively say, this is it. This is it. Okay, so let me compare. Any questions about that before I compare and contrast the old and the new? Everybody awake? Y'all look awake. Okay. Old core structure. Again, this was developed many, many years ago, and it had been many, many years since anybody had looked at it. And as you can tell, if you're familiar with this at all, it's full of acronyms, and it was very complicated. So we had 37 EEOs, exemplary educational objectives. There were as few as 5 per component area and as many as 12. I think the social behavioral sciences component area had the most. I think they had the 12. Then there were basic intellectual competencies, reading, writing, speaking, listening, and 8 perspectives, logical, reasoning, ethical behavior, aesthetic, judgment. And so we had to make sure that all of those were addressed and through the holistic view of the core curriculum. And we were to have been assessing all of these. You can't talk about this really without also talking about assessment and in IE, institutional effectiveness. Gen Ed could very well be, for those of us that are in this program, learning outcomes, conversation, a program that needs to be assessed. The coordinating board requires assessment reports submit to them on the core. That used to be until about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, that report was due very frequently. They adjusted their time frame to meet your SACS timeline. So when you submitted your SACS report on assessment of Gen Ed, you also submitted to the coordinating board your assessment of Gen Ed. So part of the challenge with this, it was just so complicated with 37 EEOs and 8 perspectives and 6 BICs. How are we assessing all of that? So part of what UEAC wanted to do was simplify that, make it more current, but simplify the structure as well. So now what we have is a purpose statement, and I actually read that earlier. We have our Gen Ed vision statement, which is unique to us. Then there are 6 core objectives. So every Texas public institution is addressing these same 6 core objectives in their core curriculum. Not a whole lot different than what you saw in the BICs. Well, I mean, it sounds similar, but for the UEAC's research and in that report, those reports they created, they addressed that these skills were needed in the 21st century. Critical thinking, communication, empirical and quantitative gets into math, teamwork. A lot of questions. How do you measure teamwork? How do you assess teamwork? How do you put that into the class? Social responsibility, personal responsibilities. And now there are only 3 or 4 of those core objectives matched to each component area. So instead of 37 and 8 and 6, we're down to 6 and 3 to 4. So it's just a much easier structure to work within. I'm not going to click it now, but when we put this, we will put this up on the COAT website. There's hyperlinks in here too, like the vision statement and to some other resources I'll show you. So I won't do that right now. So another comparative, the component areas didn't change that much. Some of the language did, but so communication, math, natural science, now life and physical, humanities, visual performing, now language, philosophy and culture with creative arts separated, history, government, social and behavioral sciences. So those didn't change tremendously. I know you can't see this, but I didn't recreate it. I want to just look at the overall, the details of it really don't matter. When we said that the core objectives were mapped to the component area, so what you're looking at is a coordinating board document that lists the foundational component area. Does this have I don't have a pointer on here. Communication, math, life, physical science, language, philosophy and culture, creative arts. Then across the top are the CT, it stands for critical thinking, we just saw that. COM is communication, EQS, empirical and quantitative, whatever those are. If that blue dot is solid, then courses in that component area must address critical thinking for communication, communication obviously, teamwork, and personal responsibility. So any curriculum team that wanted to submit a course for this component area had to make sure that their student learning outcomes and their assessment addressed at least those required core objectives. And so that mapping is available for each component area. And each component area is defined by the state. So because you can't see it, I'll read it to you, and I'll just stick with communication because it's at the top. The courses in this category focus on developing ideas, expressing them clearly, considering the effect of the message, fostering understanding, building the skills needed to communicate persuasively. Courses involve the command of oral, written and visual literacy skills that enable people to exchange messages appropriate to the subject, occasion, and audience. So there's a defined intent for each component area. And then, again, the mapping to the required core objectives. Now, I know you can't see this one either, but again, just the bigger picture here is the point. This is just an example of a product that was developed, a tool that was used by the Gen Ed committee for communication again, where those courses, English 1301, Speech 1311, Speech 13, etc., were submitted for consideration into the core, and which of those areas were met. So English 1301 under critical thinking met all three requirements, and all three requirements under communication. When you look at this, and this is a document that's 2 pages, single spaced, 0.6 font, and you see that at a glance you can see that all of the required component area objectives are met or not. Are there any gaps?
And how did they determine, for instance, what were they using to determine it?
The proposals that were submitted by the curriculum teams. That it informed this matrix.
And who was on the Gen Ed committee? It's a mixture of, the names.
I've got the names listed on the last slide,
Okay.
but it was faculty.
Okay.
And then there were subcommittees, and David was the faculty senate president rep on the Gen Ed committee. There were subcommittees then formed for each component area. And so I've got that listed as well. Okay, so I mentioned that the 42 semester credit hours, that's a big deal because it really takes away some flexibility that we have in our current core, and our range is 42 to 48 hours. And now it's 42 done. We also don't have any flexibility in the component area hours. If they say it's 6 hours, it's 6 hours. It's not 8, it's 6. Okay, so people are going to go, start to clue in. Okay, where's our challenge going to be? Science, because they're all 4-hour courses. 4 and 4 is 8. We can only have 6. What do you do with those 2 hours? And so that was one of the key challenges that we had to look at, that had to be looked at as well. This is just a quick count, and I can't guarantee you 100% that I counted accurately, because like I typically do when I put presentations like this together, it's on my couch, it's 2 in the morning, I'm watching Jimmy Fallon reruns, and I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I may be off just a little bit, but the point here is the old column were the number of courses in the core for that component area. The new column is the number of courses now proposed for the new core. So you can see some differences there. Communication went from English 1301 and English 1302, 2 courses. Everybody was going to get English 1301 and 1302. To now there's actually 4. It's English 1301 and choose from 3 speech. So I just was trying to get a sense of where some of the big changes were just in the number of courses that are offered in the core. You can see creative arts was a pretty dramatic cut, and I'll explain that one here in just a minute. You can't see this either, but you've got it on your table. This is the catalog format for the proposed 2014 core, and it's 2-sided. One is for academic, one's AAS, because they have to have 15 hours in the AAS. You can see where we're headed with this. And I'll talk through what some of the big changes are. I've already mentioned communication with now English 1301 and 3 hours of speech. It's important, and part of the conversations we had is if you'll look, the way this is printed in the catalog matters, because what wasn't intended was for a student to meet the communication component area by getting 2 speeches. The intent was English 1301 and speech. And if that wasn't printed correctly in the catalog and you just listed 4 courses, well, they could pick speech 1311, 1315 and be done. So that was a very key detail. Of course, we had some of that in our old core as well, but those kind of nuances and things really mattered as we looked at how these were listed in the catalog. Math is pretty straightforward, usually is. Life and physical sciences. If I were quizzing you, I'd ask you, what do you make of the fact that I just told you you can only have 6 hours in the science component area, but our catalog is showing it as 8? Is that a typo? It was, how do you explain to a student in the catalog that these 2 hours are going to count down here, but you've got to take them up here? I think what was decided, I didn't put this together, that it's 8 hours, but those 2 hours are in the core. It's just under another component area. And I'll explain that more in just a minute. But to try to describe that, it doesn't matter a lot. It's 8 hours. Legislatively, it's 6 hours. And that may matter in the future if we ever revise the courses again that are in science. Okay, so I've alluded to this already. 42 semester credit hours, SCH is semester credit hours in the core, period. Life and physical sciences, we're going to compare that and math, because it sounds like we're talking out of both sides of our mouth, and we aren't, but it sounds like we are. All courses, if you look at the science classes that are listed for the core, they're all 4-hour courses, right? They're all lab science, and everybody felt really strongly that we needed to retain lab sciences in the core. There's not a 3-hour science class because there's not a pathway to complete the core with a 3-hour course. Those lab hours have to remain within the core. The only place to count those lab hours is in the component area option, which is only 6 hours. And that's just where it's called now the institutionally designated option. It's where institutions have room to add their unique requirements that fit the culture of their institution. All right, so that can only be 6. We just subtracted 2 of them with lab. We've only got 4 component area semester credit, only 4 semester credit hours in the component area option left. But math, we have some 3-hour and we have some 4-hour. The component area requirement is we can only have 3. So how is that working? Because we're not taking that 4th hour of math out of the component area option. The reason is that there are 2 pathways to be in core complete in math. You can take a 3-hour class or you can take a 4-hour class. If you choose the 4-hour class, that 4th hour is outside the core and transfers as an elective hour. Y'all follow me at all on that?
And Leanne, does that apply toward the elective options within the degree plan, at 1 hour?
I don't know. Good question. Now, if there was ever a time that science curriculum team said, we want to have a 3-hour science option in the core, I don't know if they will. I'd be a little bit surprised. Some institutions do. If the science curriculum team came and said, we're going to have a 3-hour option in the core, then all of a sudden those 2 lab hours can also move outside the core, and we've just opened up a little bit more flexibility in our component area option. What's, the give and take on that? How strongly are we going to stand behind all science have to have labs? But if we want something else in component area, we can't. There's some real tension that can build because of that. Creative arts was probably one of the most difficult ones to swallow. And I know that folks are already preparing for review and reconsideration in this area, and that's a good thing. Having those conversations is good. And they're having them now in preparation for the next fall 14, it'll be effective fall 15 adjustments. UEAC, remember I started with, they can't be narrowly focused on skills. UEAC is recommendation to the coordinating board, and I even called Rex Peoples, and I said, Rex, is this what that really means? And he said yes. Is that performance-based courses shouldn't be core curriculum courses. And you saw when I compared the number of courses in the core, the drastic change in numbers. Because currently we've got studio art, we have music, we have courses that are performance-based. SAC's also statement about focusing on skills and being narrowly focused resulted in the elimination of those courses from the core. And that was one of the most difficult considerations. There are a lot of arguments as to why they could be in the core. Folks are working on that, but it is now, as it is, those are not in the core. When we get to next steps, remind me and I'll share what I think needs to happen with that to ensure that that continues to be vital. Communication, as I mentioned earlier, and Kim's in here, she can probably speak to this as well. Speech and English initially were pitted against each other. What's resulted, they came back together, worked together to submit proposals. And in the end, instead of English 1302 being a given, as it is in the current core, under the communication area, it's in the component area option. Okay? We already had 4 hours. We only had 4 hours left in the component area option. English 1302 is a 3-hour class. We have 1 hour left in the component area option. Language, philosophy, and culture, that was also a fairly significant change. The objectives and all the intent of that component area now resulted in that language acquisition courses are not core courses. They need to be the broader humanities, culture-based type courses. The flip side of that is now all 2311, 2312 level foreign language courses are proposed for the core. Bit of a flip. I've been hammering on the component area option, so I've already said it's reduced to 4 available hours. You can choose English 1302 or 2311 technical writing. So for the first time and probably ever, a student can graduate from here without taking English 1302 because they could take 2311. That ties to, well, let me go there yet. Kinesiology, we're down to 1 hour. Kinesiology remains in the core. They revised the curriculum. In our current core, it's and kinesiology and choose from a list of activity courses, right? Like 42 of them, whatever we wanted to do. I wish Bruce was here. The kinesiology curriculum team took this very seriously and completely revamped the course and met the requirements to be included in the core curriculum. And now I won't get into it, they've just done a really good job and made a very good proposal for why that should be included. What's missing is the student success course. And I can tell you from I'm not going to tell you a percentage, I'll just say most institutions in Texas have a student success course in their core, and we do not. Can't say that everybody does, but a lot of them do, and a lot of them are using EDUC 1300, which we had originally started with. The problem we've got, and if we try to put EDUC 1300 in the core as it is, we don't have room for it, because we've used our hours. Is EDUC 1300 going to replace English 1302? That's a fight. That's probably not going to happen. So where does it go? Is it a 1-hour course? Well, then what do you do with kinesiology? I mean, there's just, you start to see the constraints and some of the big decisions that have to be made when you're limited like that. Student success course will not be considered anytime soon for the core. Maybe at some point in the future that'll be. Okay, so what do we do now? We wait for the coordinating board. We have to update college policy. If you go to board policy now and look, it's basically just a regurgitation of all the Texas Education and Administrative Code language, and all of that's changed. So our board policy reflects old legislative language. Got to update our catalog. And the key message on this is that Dr. Rogers has said that the core will be reviewed and updated annually. And so we're not going to go a long time without addressing some of these concerns. Okay, so why it matters. Before I go there, any questions about all of that technical stuff? I can't believe you're still awake. Everybody good?
Additionally, aren't we gonna have to update all of our degrees prior to fall enrollment?
In the catalog?
To make sure that what's in the core.
Kathy's question, are we gonna have to update all of our degrees, is actually a good segue into one of the next steps, so I'll go ahead and talk about it now. Through the completion by design, Texas Completes, Lodestar Completes, whatever we're calling it, one of the key components of that all along has been the establishment of guided programs of study. Okay? Well, that language right now has been put on the table. When we talk about guided programs of study, aren't we talking about majors? Should we not just call it a major? Because none of us can say guided programs of study, majors, without saying majors after saying guided programs of study. And that was a question someone said earlier, maybe I missed it anyway. Once we have a major in art, a major in music, then we develop those studio courses in a major, and the core informs that major, but then we truly can guide students. If you want to be an art student and transfer to SAM or UNT or wherever you want to go, here's the core courses you need to take, here are the major courses you need to take. That will be one solution to some of that challenge that we've got right now with those types of courses. Kathy's question about, well, we need to update all of our degrees. Marie Thibodeau actually did a comparative, and I think this was, well, I'll tell you what I was going to say, but I'll tell you second thought. A comparative of impact on programs in the workforce area primarily. One of the disconnects, I think, in the process, generally, I can't say not everybody, but generally, was that I don't think the workforce faculty were really engaged or brought in purposefully by the curriculum teams on, hey, we're fixing to change this, what's this going to do to you? And that might have been a weak link in the process. Marie did a quick look at that, and there are really a fairly short list of workforce programs that are going to be negatively impacted by any of the changes here. That those are gonna have to be looked at.